Thank you, Rob. Next up is Professor Joel Gunn.
So I've kind of been with Rob on this from the beginning, but for obscure reasons, because there not only was there Ilopango, but there's other events going on at the same time. And my concern has always been what the aftermath of this, whatever this conflagration in the 530s and 540s was. And so it was a shock to me when I heard that there was any question about the dating of Ilopango, apart from the radiocarbon plateau. But let's see. I put together some slides, and we can go on to the next one now. The main point of what I'm concerned with is why you get so much variation in the impacts of these clearly huge events in the history of the world's environment. And I started doing the same thing Rob did, which is kind of trying to put together a list of how we got from where we were, say, in the 90s to where we are now. And of course, this was submitted 5 days ago, so it's been going. If you want to see the most updated version of this, send me an email and I can give you an even less legible slide to look at. But anyway, I think if I could step back in time 5 days, I might put a different subtitle on the topic of what my remarks concern, and that is also like what Rob did. Is I think that I would change the title to From Landscape to Waypoint, and that's using using a spatial analogy for what has happened, at least for me, which is probably starting out in graduate school. I had viewed culture changes occurring across many across periods. Both historians and archaeologists have these historical periods, and they're kind of really periods of stability or relative stability. But then you have these other events like the ones that Ilopango is involved with, in which there's a sudden change it's not necessarily just volcanoes that are causing these events. My ecologist friend and frequent co-author John Dake like to call them bottlenecks or whatever, but they're kind of sudden changes in cultures. And what's really handy about events like 536 is it's worldwide. So you have samples of how cultures are changing over time, that you have many replications of the experiment. And let's see if I could have the next slide. Recently, I've been teaching a course on the ethnohistory of Africa, and coincidentally reading on the far north in Europe. And the outcome of this has been that I ran across very different outcomes to the 536 events, that the so-called AD 536 event, which is now expanded to a late antique little ice age. And what I want to bring out with this little bit of information here is that across 45 degrees of latitude between northern Scotland and the Western Sahel in Africa, you have in one event extremely different looks at at what happens when you get a monstrous event like this. Like in northern Scotland, both of these areas are on what we call ecotones or changes. Like this is in the change from the Arctic to the temperate zone in northern Scotland, and this is from the Sahara Desert to the tropics. Very brief ecotone there between those two. And what fascinates me about these is that after Ilopango, or after the 536 event, before that, it was basically a pale reflection of the Roman Empire in northern British Isles. They had agriculture, built roads, put tombs by the roads like the Romans did, started to learn how to write in runic script like the Romans tended to do, things like that. But then afterwards, it became an Arctic environment. And so both the Picts who were living there before the Romans and other people who came to join them, somewhat unwelcome, I'm sure, the Vikings and the Celts from across from Ireland, all of those people, they quit the interior of the north of Scotland and moved to the coast and became fishermen and hunters of sea mammals, kind of Eskimos after a fashion. And so that's one outcome, that you lose agriculture and civilization in a lot of ways, although that is also the time that Christianity came into northern Scotland. But then if you look down here in the Sahel, before 536, they had what are called microstates. Every village was simply established around a defensible position. And so there were hundreds of these little microstates all across there. But then afterwards, a more pluvial set of conditions set in. And rather than dispersing, there was a conjoining of states into empire, or these microstates into empires. And they started doing big business, basically going from local bits of trade here and there to massive movements of salt southward from the Sahara Desert, and gold northward into and across the Sahara Desert. And so you get these two very contrasting situations going on. And I guess that's about the time that I have, and be happy to turn it over to our next knowledge.
Joel, you can continue. We've got a bit of a cushion. I think you have time to get through your slides.
Okay, let's go on to the next slide. What happens in between the extremes of latitude is all kinds of interesting things. Of course, there's the Roman Empire, which has been nearly thrashed to death on this, but that's where where most of the written records are. You get the mystery cloud of 536, 537. They're running out of food they're at 537. You get the plague coming in 541, and so on like that. And in the end, the population of Europe has been massively reduced. Over the course of that change, the population of Rome was reduced from a very considerable, what probably wasn't the million people that it was at the height of the Roman Empire, but it turns out that the Goths were very good rulers of the Roman Empire, and the city, but then the city was attacked by the Eastern Roman Empire at that time to get it back from the Goths, and the consequence of that was huge amount of warfare. And that wrecked a lot of the infrastructure of Rome. I'm sure it must be terribly difficult to judge exactly what this damage to the infrastructure was. But for example, there were 13 aqueducts coming into Rome before AD 536, and there were 2 left afterwards. And so you have this huge situation. But what really I think is important to think about here is that there's a question there. Is the destruction of Rome due to the Eastern Roman Empire coming in with an army and overrunning Rome, or was it the subsequent famines and plagues and so on? Of course, the answer is that it's all of them. And this is generally the answer to these changes every time. It doesn't necessarily even start with a volcano, but some tremendous ecological event certainly is one of the frequent starters of cascades of change. And what's immediately interesting about this is that the world economic system at this point is sort of poised for a lot of infractions on its integrity. Now, there's if you look at some other part of the mid latitudes, like one of my favorite bits of information that came out of the original 536 impacts volume in 2000 was that Karen Walker, who excavated the Pine Island site in South Florida, more or less still in the mid latitudes, although getting down toward the lower latitudes, the population, there is no evidence that the population was damaged there, and it actually started to increase. And her laconic quip on that was, well, worse things can happen to you in South Florida than have cooler summers. And so there's quite the difference in impacts there as you move into the lower latitudes. And of course, you get these those differences. All right, let's go on to the next slide. How are we doing on time?
You have 2 minutes left.
2 minutes. That's about what I need, because what another thing that this little conference has done is jarred me into thinking about what I probably should have been thinking all along, is what happened to the city of Calakmul in this, and how does Calakmul fit into this, which is one of the largest cities in the Maya lowlands, and the biggest time for Calakmul is in the about 600, 700 AD, when it managed to organize something of the closest thing that the Maya lowlands probably ever came to some kind of a state level organization. But it was because of the limited ability to put forth armies of conquest at the time. Most of the control that a city-state could exert went out to about a day's march, which according to Arlen Chase is about 60 kilometers. That's a day's march for an army, and they couldn't get much beyond that. And they managed to keep things in order in the Maya lowlands largely by dint of threat, through that. But if you look back in the previous century, our 536 event century, well, you see that, and this is all stuff that's coming out fairly recently. It's kind of in its basic form in Martin and Grube's 2008 issue of the Chronicles of the Kings of the Maya lowlands. But what you can see in that is that there was really something serious going on in the 6th century in the Maya lowlands that we probably don't know too much about. But what's different about it, there were 2 kings, Sky Witness and Scroll Serpent, in the 6th century or very early 7th century. And these guys were doing amazing things in turn. They went on a conquest rampage. Scroll Serpent, for instance, was able to revisit Palenque twice in 599 and 611 and reprimand them for doing whatever bad things that they were doing with an army. And that's 243 kilometers away from Calakmul. And so they were able to strike 4 times the distance. And one of the things that probably needs to be thought about is there something going on in the Maya lowlands that weakened those intervening polities between Calakmul and Palenque and gave them the options to make those long strikes and establish the basis of an empire. So this kind of puts the Maya lowlands and the Western Sahel in a similar situation where, although they got wrapped in some fashion or another, undoubtedly, like we can tell from a test bit. This is one of those one sample things. We can't put a lot of weight on this, but it looks like the city, the urban footprint of Calakmul shrank a little bit after the 536, but then came back later on. And
Joel, sorry, got to wrap it up.
That's it. You got
Okay.
the picture. They got themselves in a mess for a while over 536, but they seem to have also massively benefited from it.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. And fascinating the way that you pull in all these places all over the world and show the impact of the event. And that our next speaker is